Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Brumas del Zurquí wash processed Costa Rica from Jimmy Bean's Coffee. There's the bag right there. And Jimmy Bean's, based out of Chicago, Illinois. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. Now, there is a bit of a backstory behind this coffee roaster, so let's take you through that real quick. And all of this started when the then roaster of Jimmy Bean's, Max, reached out to us asking if we'd be interested in reviewing some of their coffees. And after some messages back and forth, we decided to purchase several of their coffees, including this Costa Rica. However, after we started working on these reviews, Jimmy Bean's closed down and let go of all of their staff. And as of the time of recording, it is unknown whether they will return in any capacity. In the meantime, Max has opened up his own coffee roaster called Shoebox Coffee Roasters, and I will include the link to them down below for anybody that is interested. But for now, we will see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 53. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I should start with this. Max is heavily influenced by H&S, and the coffees that we are reviewing from Jimmy Bean's were also roasted on the Diedrich, and I could see a lot of that influence in these coffees, as well as I would say that they are probably closer to being on par with H&S's lighter offerings. They do have a lot of their offerings listed as very light by their standards, and I could definitely see it maybe being a little lighter than that, but for the most part, I would say definitely lighter than the average American coffee roaster out there by a distance, and a bit more on par with those standard light offerings from H&S. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression through the V60, and I was quite surprised at how sweet this coffee was and the level of intensity that it did offer. As going into it, I was wondering just how close it would be to H&S's level of, we'll say, roast profile, given that a lot of H&S's coffees, especially their ultralight offerings, can be a bit too, we'll say, tame on the earlier impressions. So this coffee having that very high level of sweetness and intensity was definitely a little bit of a surprise given the expectations that I did have for it going into it, but I wasn't complaining by any means, as I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from this coffee too much. Now, I should put into context, this one was featured in the Mystery Coffee League, and I purchased, I want to say, one of the last releases of this coffee, as I wanted to kind of stall working on these reviews until we finished some of our backlog. And by the time that we had actually started working on this coffee, this day 22 mark, they had just released the information for what this coffee was. So I was aware that it was this wash processed Costa Rican coffee, but even then, I would say that it probably mirrored a lot of the expectations for what I would have had from this coffee once I found out what it was. It did have a slight bit of a tart apple-like brightness to it as well, so it was off to a pretty nice start. Day 25 through the Chemex, and the coffee does offer a, we'll say, slightly medicinal lemon cough drop and Terraflu-like feel to it, as it is presented in a candied sense, and I would say that that is probably one of the few days where I got a slightly undesirable quality to this coffee, but it is something that I definitely felt like was worth highlighting within this one, as it did feel marred by that candy feel. And I know it's kind of interesting to say that a coffee can be less impressive due to a candied-like sense, but when it's presented in that, I want to say, slightly artificial sense, it wasn't necessarily ideal. In addition to that, there are some slight honey tones to the coffee, with it being tart yet again, so pretty even nonetheless. I did appreciate the majority of the experience from this coffee. It was just that kind of interesting, more lemon aspect that I wasn't the biggest fan of on this day. Day 28. To the April brewer, and the coffee is a little bit different in this brew method, as it's skewing a little bit more on a slightly vanilla spice-like tone, reminiscent of what I would describe as a vanilla chai. In addition to that, it offers plenty of that sweetness yet again, with brightness and tartness a little bit more toned down this time around. Day 31 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so given that this coffee was influenced by H&S, I definitely wanted to brew accordingly and opt for something a little bit more similar to H&S's recipe, so higher temperatures, lower concentration, more fine grind, and the coffee was actually the best it had been to this point, as it was the most intense it had been to this point. Still offering a nice combination of the sweeter spiced tea, but also some complementary tartness yet again, so just better in general, given that it still had a lot more of those sweeter qualities to it. Day 34 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's another nice day as it does feel pretty even with more of the spiced tea qualities presented in a better balanced sense. Fruit qualities presented in the back, including some slight melon and honeyed qualities, so nice yet again. And the honeyed qualities were some of those that I experienced, I would say, quite consistently throughout this coffee, as that seemed to be an ever-present quality within it. Day 37 through the V60 with our standard recipe. And while the coffee has been pretty consistent for the most part, this was actually the best it had been to this point, which did give a little bit more credence to the notion that it just improved with time as opposed to the adjustments that we had actually made. I feel like you can push this coffee a bit, but I think I liked the balance of it a little bit more when we kept it at a much more even recipe. It's offering an abundance of characteristics ranging from a slightly spiced vanilla chai, cinnamon vanilla chai, to the tartness that's reminiscent of both apples and lemons with plenty of these softer melon and sugary stone fruit qualities to it. So a fair bit of depth. This is a geisha coffee, so I think in theory you should expect at least a little bit of depth to something like this. And then day 41, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and more of the same as the coffee does offer plenty of the citric tartness and brightness to go with that notable spiced experience. Fruit qualities ranging from a slightly sugary stone fruit to the listed melon, floral vanilla, and honey are also notably present, as they had been for the majority of the time we were working on this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Don't feel like I have too much to say on that one. It is a washed coffee, it is a geisha coffee, and maybe there's some slight expectations that it could score higher than that, but as I always say, we reserve those for the ultra clean coffees. And while this one definitely had great clarity to it, nothing to really kind of take away from that overall experience, I would say that maybe the definition to certain aspects weren't to the same extent as some Panamanian geishas, so no surprise there that it reaches that level 4 mark. Finish level 4. I think that the finish was a kind of interesting part within this coffee because it did come in a number of different directions. That slightly spiced quality to it, that slightly more floral quality, whether it be presented in a vanilla or a honeyed-like tone, and definitely some of the fruit qualities, most specifically the citric qualities within this coffee. All of those can be present at different times within that finish, so it did have a nice bit of depth in that regard. Sweetness level 4, and a lot of me wonders whether or not that might be because of the roasting machine that was used on this coffee, the Diedrich, which oftentimes I find to be on the more sweet side of coffees in general. So I did appreciate a lot of the sweetness that was presented within this one. Definitely had a little bit more of those sugary aspects to go with it. Florality level 4, and I've mentioned a lot of the floral components that we experienced in this one, most specifically that honeyed florality, that vanilla-like florality. And given that Costa Rican geishas in general do usually offer qualities similar to that, it's not surprising we experienced an abundance of those. Citrus fruit level 4, plenty of the lemon qualities. It's one of the first and most highlighted qualities that we mentioned within this coffee. If I recall correctly, I think that green apple was one of the notes that a lot of the people from the Mystery Coffee League picked up within this coffee, and it could have been because there was that pretty prominent tartness to this one. So I could definitely see that as well, kind of falling into that citric category. Handful of level 3s, we will start with the acidity level 3. I would say that there were times I wondered whether or not the brightness could score a little higher, but usually we keep just your standard washed Kenyan as the metric for reaching a level 4, and it wasn't quite as bright as that, so we decided to leave it there. A little lower, level 3, still plenty of brightness to go within this one. Berry fruit, level 3. I think one of the other highlighted qualities of this coffee was a fruit melon-like aspect, and there were times I would say it was more prominent, not necessarily the most abundant quality within this coffee, but present enough to highlight it within this tasting wheel. Same thing with the stone fruit, a little bit more in the sugary sense, given that this coffee was a bit more on the sugary side of things, so definitely felt a fair bit of that. Another pretty interesting thing in this tasting wheel is that the body scored a level 3, a slightly higher bodied cup of coffee than I might have expected going into it, just a fair bit more texture in general, so that did give it some additional depth. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, not too much else worth discussing. I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Actually, there's one more thing, the spiced quality, and that's, of course, being that vanilla and kind of cinnamon tone to it. But yes, outside of that, I don't think that there's anything else worth discussing within this tasting wheel. All right, So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Of the 3 coffees that we are discussing from Jimmy Beans, this one was actually my least favorite of the 3, which is why we opted to review this one first. That being said, I did enjoy this coffee. It offered plenty of attributes that I do like: great cleanliness, some really nice sweetness, some interesting florality, and some nice fruit qualities as well, even if the fruit qualities did skew a little bit more on the citric side of things. But given that of 3 coffees, this one is my least favorite, it goes to show just how much more I enjoyed those other 2 coffees, given that I do have quite a few positive things to say about the experience that we did have from this coffee roaster, even if technically they no longer exist. But we'll discuss those coffees a little further in depth when we get into those. But for now, the type of person that I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like if you do like your tartness, that's what really stood out to me with this coffee, as it had that in a couple of different aspects. So mentioned there's that kind of more tart apple-like brightness. There's also that more citric brightness to it as well. That does give it that kind of sharp, interesting tartness in general. Still complemented well by a very high level of sweetness, really enjoyable level of clarity, and some nice fruit depth outside of that, as well as that interesting spiced quality that you can experience from a lot of these Costa Rican geishas. So kind of put that together, that's the best direction I can point somebody towards in this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Jimmy Beans while they still existed, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Brumas del Zurquí, wash processed Costa Rica from Jimmy Beans Coffee. Thanks for watching.